The Montana wilderness had never felt so unforgiving. The bitter wind sliced through the trees like invisible blades, carrying with it the sharp bite of midwinter cold. Wildlife Ranger Daniel Carter pulled his coat tighter around himself, his breath visible in the freezing air. Snow crunched under his boots as he made his way through the vast expanse of pine and fir, his eyes scanning the landscape for any signs of movement. The morning had been still, too still. A heavy silence blanketed the valley, save for the occasional distant call of a raven. Daniel had patrolled this territory for years, and he had learned that silence in the wilderness was often a sign that something was wrong. Predators, injuries, or even death left behind a quiet void. It was an instinctual feeling, a sixth sense that had developed after years of tracking animals, following footprints in the snow, and learning to read the land. Then, through the howling wind, he heard it. A sound so faint, so weak, that at first, he thought it was the wind whistling through the trees. But when it came again, a barely audible whimper, his pulse quickened. He adjusted his gloves and turned toward the sound, his instincts guiding him toward the unseen source of distress. His boots sank deep into the thick powder as he pushed through the undergrowth. The further he moved, the louder the whimper became. His heart pounded. It was an animal, and whatever it was suffering. After another minute of searching, he found it. There, huddled beneath the twisted roots of a fallen pine tree, was a tiny bear cub. No more than 3 months old, its small body trembled violently against the merciless cold. Its fur was matted with ice and streaked with dried blood. The cub's eyes, clouded with exhaustion and pain, lifted weakly to meet Daniel's. The sight tore through him. Everywhere there were signs of trauma. Deep gashes lined the cub's ribs, as if it had barely escaped the clutches of a predator. Its thin frame told a story of weeks without food, a tale of survival that was quickly slipping away. Daniel had seen death in these mountains countless times before. The law of nature was brutal, and the weak were rarely given second chances. But something about this tiny creature struck a chord in him that he couldn't ignore. The cub whimpered again, a sound so faint, so fragile, that it sent a painful ache through Daniel's chest. He knew the protocols. Leave wild animals where they belong. Do not interfere with nature. Do not let emotion cloud judgment. But as he knelt next to the shivering cub, watching its slow, labored breaths fog in the air, something inside him shattered. This cub didn't have time for protocols. It was dying. And he couldn't let it. Carefully, he reached for the emergency thermal blanket strapped to his belt. The crinkling sound made the cub flinch weakly, but it was too weak to move away. "Easy, little one," Daniel murmured, wrapping the warm material around its frail body. He could feel its heartbeat, slow, erratic, struggling. "This is bad," he whispered to himself. Glancing around the landscape, there was no sign of the mother, no indication that she would return. If she had been alive, she would never have abandoned her cub. That meant one thing. This tiny bear was completely alone. The thought made his chest tighten. Shifting the cub gently into his arms, Daniel felt its fragile warmth against his chest. The moment he lifted it, the cub let out a small, pained sigh, as if accepting its fate, placing its last ounce of trust in the hands of the human who now carried it. "Hold on," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Just hold on." With hurried steps, he turned back toward his snowmobile, the storm threatening to erase their tracks as soon as they were made. He didn't look back at the clearing, at the blood-stained snow, at the darkened forest that had tried to swallow the little bear whole. He had made a choice. And he wasn't going to let this cub die today. The race against time. The Mountain Haven Wildlife Center was an hour's ride from the location where Daniel had found the cub, an hour that felt like a lifetime as he rode through the snow-covered wilderness, keeping one arm wrapped securely around his tiny, fragile passenger. The cub barely moved, its breathing shallow and its body limp with exhaustion. Daniel knew that hypothermia was setting in, the deadly kind that crept in silently, numbing the senses before stealing life away completely. "Stay with me, buddy," Daniel muttered, pushing his snowmobile faster over the frozen terrain. By the time he reached the wildlife center, his fingers were numb, but his determination was burning hotter than ever. He barely had time to shut off the engine before bursting through the doors, cradling the dying cub in his arms. Dr. Olivia Reyes, the center's lead veterinarian, took one look at them and immediately called for her team. "We need fluids, heat pads, and oxygen, now." The medical bay turned into a battlefield. They worked with precision, each movement an act of desperation to save the cub's life. Warm saline dripped through and through, fighting against severe dehydration. Antibiotics were administered to combat the raging infection spreading through his body. For 72 hours, the battle between life and death raged. And Daniel never left his side. He stayed in the medical bay, sitting by the incubator where the cub lay beneath layers of heated blankets. He talked to him, even when the cub was unconscious, telling him stories of the forest, of the rivers and the towering mountains that would one day be his home again. Then, on the fourth day, the cub opened his eyes. And for the first time, Daniel saw it. Not just pain. Not just fear. But recognition. The cub lifted his tiny head, its gaze locking onto Daniel's face. And then, weakly, slowly, the little bear moved closer to the glass of the incubator. Dr. Reyes sucked in a breath. "That's remarkable." No one spoke. No one breathed. Because they all knew, this wasn't just instinct. The cub knew him. He remembered. And in that moment, Daniel knew that saving this bear wasn't just a duty, wasn't just a mission. It was a bond that would change both of their lives forever. A slow recovery. Orion, as the team had named him, proved to be a fighter. In the days following his rescue, he fought through fever, infection, and weakness, proving that despite his tiny size, he had an unbreakable will to survive. Daniel spent every possible moment beside Orion's incubator, talking to him in a soft, reassuring voice. He recounted stories of the wild, the rustling leaves in the summer wind, the crisp mountain air, the scent of pine that filled the valley after the rain. Though Orion couldn't understand the words, Daniel believed the sound of his voice made a difference. And then, there was a moment that changed everything. One evening, as Daniel was about to leave the medical bay, Orion, still weak, still healing, lifted his tiny paw and pressed it against the glass. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible. But to Daniel, it was everything. It was trust. It was a connection. And it was the beginning of something that would defy every expectation. Rehabilitation begins. Orion's strength slowly returned, but the veterinarians warned that his future was uncertain. "He's still very young," Dr. Olivia Reyes explained, watching the cub as he slept. "He should have been with his mother for at least another year. Without her, he'll have to learn everything on his own." Daniel nodded but didn't say what was really on his mind. Orion wasn't alone. He had him. With time, Orion grew strong enough to leave the medical bay and move into a specialized enclosure designed to simulate the wild. It was a critical stage in his rehabilitation. He needed to learn the instincts his mother would have taught him, how to find food, climb, and defend himself. But something was different about Orion. Unlike the other rescued cubs who remained wary of human presence, Orion remained attached to Daniel in a way that left even the researchers stunned. When Daniel arrived in the morning, Orion would be waiting by the fence, watching him with intelligent, deep-set eyes. When Daniel left in the evenings, Orion would let out a soft huffing sound, one the team had learned to identify as his version of a goodbye. It was extraordinary. Bears were not supposed to form emotional attachments to humans, especially those meant to be released back into the wild. Yet, Orion had defied every expectation. Despite his bond with Daniel, the team knew that Orion had to learn the skills of a wild bear. And so, under careful supervision, they began a gradual rewilding process. Daniel took an active role in Orion's training. He demonstrated how to tear apart logs to find insects, how to climb trees for safety, and how to track scents in the wind. And to everyone's amazement, Orion followed his lead. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. A wild animal mimicking human behavior, adapting survival skills through observation. But there was one final challenge: learning to fish. The test of instinct. By late summer, Orion had grown significantly. No longer the frail, trembling cub that Daniel had carried through the storm, he was now a powerful young bear. His thick coat gleaming under the sun. Yet, one skill still eluded him: hunting for fish. Fishing was a crucial skill. Without it, Orion wouldn't survive in the wild. Daniel had done everything possible to encourage him, placing fish in the stream, teaching him to recognize movement in the water, but Orion still struggled. Then, one day, everything changed. Daniel stood at the edge of Orion's enclosure, watching as the young bear sat beside the man-made stream. His sharp eyes locked onto the rippling surface. For a long moment, Orion remained completely still. Then, a splash. A flash of silver. Orion's massive paw shot forward, claws slicing through the water, and for the first time, he caught a fish. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Orion lifted his head, the fish thrashing in his grip, and for a moment, their eyes met. Understanding. Victory. Pride. Daniel grinned. "You did it, buddy." And in that moment, he knew Orion was ready for the next step. Saying goodbye. Orion's release date came sooner than Daniel had expected. By the time autumn arrived, Orion was fully independent. He had grown into a magnificent young bear, over 400 pounds of pure strength. He could forage, climb, and, most importantly, hunt on his own. The wildlife team had chosen a remote valley deep in the Montana wilderness as the perfect location for his release, far from human civilization, abundant with rivers, prey, and shelter. The night before the release, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat outside Orion's enclosure, watching the young bear sleep peacefully under the moonlight. It had been almost 2 years since that cold January morning when he had found him dying in the snow. And now, the moment had come to let him go. In the morning, the team loaded Orion into a transport cage. Unlike most wild animals, Orion did not fight. He didn't growl or resist. Instead, he sat quietly, watching Daniel with knowing eyes. The drive to the release site was quiet. Daniel sat in the back of the truck, his hand resting on the outside of the cage. His heart aching in a way he hadn't expected. Then, finally, they arrived. The enclosure door swung open. Orion hesitated. Most bears would have bolted for the trees, eager for freedom. But Orion turned back. For a long, silent moment, he just looked at Daniel. Then, he stepped forward. Daniel froze. The young bear moved closer, closing the distance between them. His massive paws sinking into the earth. And then, in a moment that stunned everyone, Orion did something no one expected. He rose up on his hind legs, not in aggression, not in fear, but in a gesture of understanding. Then, with slow, deliberate movement, he touched his forehead to Daniel's hand. A moment of pure connection. Pure trust. Then, as if sensing it was time, Orion turned and disappeared into the wild. And Daniel stood there, tears in his eyes, watching his best friend fade into the wilderness he was always meant to call home. 3 years later. Time passed. Daniel returned to his work. patrolling the Montana forests, protecting wildlife. But Orion was always in the back of his mind. Then, on a crisp autumn morning, he received a call that changed everything. A group of researchers had been tracking a large, unusual grizzly. "He doesn't act like the others," the lead scientist explained. "He watches humans, but never attacks." And, she hesitated, "We think he's waiting for something." Daniel's heart pounded. Could it be? The next day, Daniel arrived at the location. The moment he stepped into the clearing, he knew. The massive bear standing at the edge of the forest was Orion. For a long, breathless moment, they just looked at each other. Then, Orion stepped forward. He let out a familiar huffing sound. And Daniel, overwhelmed with emotion, whispered, "Hey, buddy. You remember me?" What happened next left everyone in tears. Orion, the wild bear who had been saved as a cub, pressed his forehead against Daniel's hand once more. A moment the world would never forget. A story of unbreakable bonds. Orion and Daniel's story taught the world that kindness is never forgotten. It was a reminder that love, even across species, can defy time, distance, and nature itself. Because some bonds are simply unbreakable. A story of unbreakable bonds and kindness beyond nature. In the vast wilderness of Montana, a wildlife ranger saved a dying bear cub against all odds. What began as a simple act of compassion turned into an extraordinary bond that defied time, nature, and expectations. Years later, the bear returned, proving that kindness is never forgotten. This heartwarming story is a testament to the power of love, trust, and second chances. Subscribe now for more incredible animal stories that will touch your heart and inspire you.